So the Nikon Z8 has been out for a few weeks now. We went up and did kind of a first look. We went up to the launch event, got our hands on the camera, tested it out, gave you some first impressions, ran down the spec, but now we've had a more extended look at the camera. We've had it for some time. We've been testing it out, doing photography, doing video, testing out the speed, all kinds of stuff to really get a feel for this camera, what it can do, what it's like to actually use in the real world, so that we can do a proper review of the camera. Now, we're not going to dive into spec too much. We already did that in the first look video. We're going to talk about it a bit, but we're just not going to go through the full spec list of everything this camera can actually do on paper. I want to talk to you more about how this camera actually feels, both from just taking it out to take kind of photos and have a good time, and from the idea of using this professionally, because this is definitely a camera that absolutely works as a professional tool, and it is a camera that I can imagine a lot of professionals are going to be keen to kind of see what it can do and is it going to fit into their workflow. Now, the first thing really that we should talk about is this and the Z9. The Z8 absolutely feels and actually works like just a smaller, lighter Z9, and I think that works just so well in its favor. I think that's such a big plus. It has extremely similar specification to the Z9, extremely similar capabilities. It's just quite a bit smaller and quite a bit lighter as well, which makes it a little bit easier when you're actually out and about shooting handheld, moving quickly, a little bit easier in your bag as well. And of course, it's a little bit cheaper as well than the Z9. Now, of course, there are still some differences. If you were going to be heading out into harsher conditions, the Z9 is really built like a tank. It's going to be able to withstand a lot of punishment. It also has a better battery life and stuff like that. But for most cases, the Z8 is going to perform basically the same as the Z9, but smaller, lighter, and cheaper. So for me, certainly for me, the Z8 would be the one that I'd be looking to get. The other huge thing that just really stood out to me while using the Z8 is that this is absolutely a hybrid camera. That's no surprise, but there just doesn't feel like there's any compromise on either photo or video. A lot of hybrid cameras, in fact, most hybrid cameras, feel like they are leaning one way or the other. They'll either be slightly more photography based, you know, with a nice high resolution, they'll be very fast at taking photos and it's great, and then good video, or they'll be very video leaning and able to take good photos, but you'll find that there's some kind of compromise, and it's not always on paper, but when you go to use the cameras, you might feel it. You'll feel that it clearly is leaning one way or the other. Whereas the Z8 for me really doesn't feel like that. It's one of the few cameras I've ever used where it really does feel like it is a proper hybrid camera that is absolutely able to excel at both sides. It is absolutely a photography camera. This is fantastic, nice high resolution, 45 megapixels, unbelievable speed as well, 20 frames a second if you're shooting in RAW, which you can do for almost up to a minute with the crazy huge buffer, or 120 frames a second if you're shooting in JPEG. That's all blackout free, by the way, as well. So we'll get back to that in a minute. And then it's absolutely a video camera. So, you know, 8K up to 30 frames a second, 4K up to 120 frames a second. You're talking about ProRes RAW, 12-bit, 422. And these aren't just specs on paper that sound great. When you're shooting with a photography brain on and shooting in the photography mode, it feels like a photography first camera. And if you switch over to video, it feels like a video first camera. I'd be incredibly comfortable going to clients with this camera just to shoot photos, no problem. Or just to shoot video, whether it's a small kind of promo video, whether I'm doing interviews, whatever I would be doing, it just feels like the camera is set up geared towards that. It just so happens that it's geared towards all of the different things. That's not something you see that often with hybrid cameras. And I think it's really important to emphasize early on that that was the main takeaway for me with the Z8. And that is really, really impressive. Possibly even more so than the Z9 actually, because of the size of the Z9, because it is a little bit bigger, a little bit weightier. It felt a little bit more geared towards photography for me, just purely because of the way it felt in the hands. Nothing to do with the spec, just the actual way it felt in the real world in my hands. Whereas the Z8 really feels like it can do both, no problem. So let's talk about actually using this in the real world. Obviously the image quality is really nice. 45 megapixel gives you lots of resolution to play around with. You can crop, that's lovely. The ISO performance is also very, very good. So you've got great low light capability within the camera. And the speed, the speed is super, super fast. Now I tested this out with my dog. I was trying to kind of throw a ball for her, get to run and try and lock on with the autofocus and follow her and try and get those shots. Shooting at 20 frames a second in RAW is super impressive. That is very, very nice. And of course, 120 frames in JPEG, and that's all blackout free, which is the kind of thing that is just so useful once you start using it. And when you go back to a camera that is gonna, black out as it's taking those photos, it just feels crazy. The biggest problem I had was my own capability when it came to this. Taking photos of my dog, running around, my biggest problem was me keeping up, actually framing it properly and trying to do that. Whereas the camera, no problem. The speed of the shots was absolutely perfect and the autofocus was absolutely able to keep up, which I really was impressed about. That was one thing I didn't feel like I got to fully test when we did the first look. So I wanted to do this. My dog kind of running around towards the camera, away from the camera, all that stuff. I wanted to get a sense for how is it going to lock on. Now, of course, this is the autofocus system we see in the Z9. So you've got a deep learning kind of algorithm, which helps with subject detection. You've got human subject detection, of course, eye, face, body. You've got animals, dogs, cats, birds, and then you've got vehicles as well. So things like trains, planes, cars, bikes. But setting this to animal autofocus, I was easily able to track my dog around as she ran around. Didn't matter if she was coming towards, away, side to side, all over the place. The only limitation I had was my own ability to actually keep up. I also tried to photograph birds in flight and moving around and actually use this in video as well. And that autofocus just seemed to keep up. Now, something else which I think is important in the Z8, and this is in the Z9 as well, is that there is no mechanical shutter. It's all electronic shutter, which at first sounds like you might not like that. Sounds like that'd be a bad thing because, in the past, purely electronic shutters maybe have had some issues, things like rolling shutter, but that doesn't seem to really be the case here. I never found any issues with rolling shutter. Nikon say they've pretty much gotten rid of it altogether, and that seemed to be the case. There are huge advantages to not having a mechanical shutter and only having electronic. First of all, it can go faster. It can go very, very fast, which is great for a lot of different reasons, including, of course, using a very fast aperture lens. So let's say an 85mm 1.4, let's say, on a very bright day, you're going to want to use a very fast shutter speed to kind of counteract just how much light is coming in, unless you want to use an ND filter, but it's kind of nice and easy to be able to use a very fast shutter speed, which you can do because it's electronic. You also don't have any wear and tear because there's no moving parts. Shutter count basically becomes irrelevant. Whereas on my camera or most cameras, you would probably want to be aware of the shutter count if you either want to sell the camera or just when it might start coming towards the end of its life. The Z8 won't ever have that problem when it comes to the shutter because it's not there. There is no mechanical piece to actually fail. I loved that on the Z9 and I love that here as well. I think that's a real step forward and I think it's great. I think it's just a great thing to have on the camera. We will talk about something that I don't like as much in a second because something else that I love on this camera is the image stabilization. Now, the official stat is up to 6 stops, but for me, there's different feelings of image stabilization. Some cameras have up to 6 stops, up to 7 stops, but don't feel as good as other cameras, which may even have a slightly lower image stabilization kind of stop count, but just feel better. And this is a camera that feels really, really good. I mean, it's actually borderline outrageous how good the image stabilization is here. So for me, the big thing I use image stabilization for is actually handheld video. I basically only shoot video handheld or on a tripod. I don't really use gimbals that much. And that is purely a speed thing. It might be a laziness thing, but I like being able to kind of run and gun, be able to get in, get out, get the shots, move around. It's very easy doing it handheld, and it's so much easier with good image stabilization. And the Z8 has extraordinary capabilities when it comes to this. Some of the time, it feels like a gimbal shot, but it's handheld. A big test for that is being able to walk with the camera and not have it look ridiculous. And that is something the Z8 is able to achieve, which is big. I mean, that's a really big thing for any videographer. If you're gonna shoot promo videos, you're gonna do short videos for companies or clients or whatever it is, knowing you can shoot handheld and get good usable footage is a huge plus. I want to touch on video as well for a second because I think it's really important and it's really incredible what this camera can do here. So 8K up to 60 frames a second, that's pretty impressive just by itself. You wouldn't use that all the time because your storage would just be ridiculous, but it's an incredibly useful thing to have. And up to 60 frames a second, that means you can actually get slow motion in 8K. And of course, the big kind of advantage of shooting at such a high resolution like that is being able to crop in, to actually punch into your footage and really change the framing in the edit. 4K 120, which is a big deal. I think that that's just very important now to have that. ProRes RAW, you can shoot 12-bit 422. It's also important to mention there's no crop to any of these video modes, which isn't, one of those super crazy stats you hear about, but it's really important, right? It's a good thing to know about how you're going to shoot your footage. It is going to be what you would expect it to be. The actual framing is going to be how you should expect on whatever lens you're using. But outside of just the spec of it, it's also just very, very capable. For example, you can shoot 8K 30 frames a second for up to 90 minutes before any issues with overheating. That's a long time. That's a really long time. So you could easily shoot an interview in 8K if you wanted to. No problem, without really having to think about the timing of it, unless you're going for a really, really long interview. And of course, you can shoot 4K up to 60 frames a second for over 2 hours, which means that you could shoot an entire football match, for example. If you're shooting a football match, which you might want to shoot at 60 or 50 frames a second, you can shoot that in 4K without worrying about anything like overheating. Really, your only problems are going to be battery life and storage. And I mean, that is going to be a lot of storage, especially if you shoot 90 minutes at 8K. That is going to be intense, but that's fine. You can get whatever storage you want to use. In fact, speaking of storage, you've got 2 card slots here. So CF Express or XQD and then SD, which I think is good. It might have been nice to see 2 CF Express card slots, but I actually think that it's nice to see 1 CF Express and 1 SD. I think that that's kind of important, because if you're not going to take advantage of that speed on a shoot, or if you're not going to shoot 8K or 4K 120, you can use an SD card. That's absolutely fine. And you could actually use that as your kind of backup with your CF Express as the kind of fast card. So for me, and I think even in a professional environment, that's absolutely fine. The actual design of the camera is very nice. It does feel very, very good in the hands. It's smaller, it's lighter than the Z9, but it feels good. The grip is very comfortable. The ergonomics of the buttons, fantastic. Let's talk about something I don't love as much. This is personal preference, to be honest with you. It's not a specific thing that I think is wrong with the camera. It's just something I don't personally like as much, and that is the way that the screen folds out. I get it, I totally get it. It's just not really for me. I like a flip out screen. I love a flip out screen, but this kind of flips out in a slightly awkward way, and for me personally, I just find it a little bit awkward to use, and it just would slow me down by a half a second, but it's enough for me to think about it. And I just wish it was just either a normal flip out screen that just flips out to the side, you can rotate it and all that kind of stuff, or even just a flip down screen. I think I'd be fine with that. I just don't love this type of flip out screen. Other than that, the screen looks fantastic. It's very bright. The EVF looks good. It's not the highest resolution that we've ever seen, but it absolutely does the job. It's the kind of camera that looks good through the EVF. I mean, really, the only negative I have is that I don't personally love the way the screen flips out, which, let me tell you, I could get over it. I could get over it very quickly for this camera. Other than that, it works so well. It's crazy how well this camera works, and it's very, very impressive. This is the camera for me over the Z9, because I don't need the kind of advantages the Z9 brings, and it would be great to have it in this smaller, lighter package. This sits really in a kind of league of the best cameras out there at the moment. It might be the best camera out there at the moment, especially when you think about hybrid cameras. This is incredibly capable. It's a lovely camera to actually use, which is even more important, to be honest. I've used cameras with very good specs, which just don't feel as good as this camera to actually use, don't feel as good in the hands. The way the camera feels is arguably more important, I think, to how you're going to be using it in the real world. Whether you're a photographer just enjoying yourself and having kind of an enthusiast time, whether you're a professional, whether you're a videographer, whatever you're using it for, it's important that it feels good, that it's intuitive to use, and that it works for you. And I think the Z8, just everything works for you. It's just making your life as a photographer not just easy, because the autofocus works really well, the image stabilization works really well, but fun, right? And enjoyable and creative, and actually helping you get to that final image that you want to take. And I really could not recommend this camera enough. If you're looking for something to use professionally, or just to have out and about, but to have a really, really good camera, this is not only a fantastic choice, I really think that this will last you a long time as well. Very, very high-end stuff in there, and I think you're gonna love it. Hopefully this hasn't come across as too overwhelmingly positive, but honestly, it's one of those cameras that I've just really, really liked using it. It's one of those ones that it's sad to have to send back to Nikon. I just want to use it now. I wish I was filming it now. Of course, you can check out all the specs, the pricing, everything for the Z8 by checking the link down in the description. You can go and check everything out down there. There's all the fun stuff to go and look at. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well. There's new content all the time. I will see you next time. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.